Another bombshell in the Sean Diddy Combs trial as a new alleged victim took the stand, backing up Cassie Ventura's claims and making some new ones of her own. This former assistant broke down on the stand, claiming she was sexually abused by Diddy and described how she was allegedly controlled and humiliated by the man who employed her. I'm Kennedi Walker, and you're watching Law&Crime. This courtroom sketch shows the woman who arguably delivered some of the most harrowing testimony yet in the federal trial against Sean Combs. Her face is intentionally left blank. This is because her identity is being shielded from the public. Only the jurors know her real name. To the public, she's known as Mia. Mia worked as Combs' personal assistant for 8 years. On the stand, she gave a detailed account of what she says happened behind the scenes. She told the jury she lived in fear, saying she didn't feel safe telling Diddy no. Mia backed up Cassie Ventura's claims of abuse, testifying, quote, "I've seen him attack her. I've seen him throw her on the ground. I've seen him crack her head open." She recalled one violent episode where she feared for Cassie's life, saying, quote, "I just saw him pick her up, and I thought he is actually going to kill her. He slammed her head into the corner of the bed." But the most emotional part of Mia's testimony was what she says Combs did to her. She claimed the abuse began just months after she was hired. It was Combs' 40th birthday party in New York. She told the court he handed her 2 shots that, in her words, hit her hard. Then she said he kissed her and put his hand up her dress. Mia described another incident, this time inside Diddy's Los Angeles mansion. She told jurors that house rules forbade her from locking her bedroom door. Diddy, she claimed, would often say, quote, "This is my house. No one locks my doors." One night, she said she woke up to find him on top of her and alleged that he raped her. She said she couldn't say no to him because no meant risking everything, testifying, quote, "I couldn't tell him no about a sandwich. I couldn't tell him no about anything." The prosecution asked, "What were you afraid would happen if you told Mr. Combs no with regard to sex?" Mia responded that he would fire me and ruin my future and somehow twist the story into making me look like a threat. In another alleged incident, she said Diddy forcibly slammed her arm into a door after she chased him down for taking her phone. When she found him later, Mia testified that he said, "I sent all of your compromising and inappropriate photos to my phone just in case you ever have something on me." Mia's testimony echoed Cassie's, who also accused Diddy of years of abuse. 2 women, 2 nearly identical stories. Both say they were sexually assaulted by Sean Combs. Both described a man who was allegedly violent and controlling. And both took the stand in his federal trial. Mia testified that Diddy, quote, "treated me like I was a worthless piece of crap." She said she was constantly cursed out, humiliated, and berated. Cassie told the jury she felt humiliated and disgusting. When asked why she didn't come forward, Mia told prosecutors, quote, "I was going to die with this. I didn't want anyone to know, ever." 2 women speaking up, 2 voices, once silenced, now heard in the same courtroom. And joining me to talk more about this is former Deputy Public Defender Philip Dubé. Philip, thank you so much for coming on today.
Bless you for having me.
So let's just dive right in. How important is Mia's testimony in this trial?
Oh, are you kidding? She's the linchpin, or at least one of them, because remember, he is charged with RICO, which is the Racketeering, Influence, Organized Corruption, etc. Act. And they basically have to show a pattern of predicate criminal activity. So the one-off, the isolated incidents won't bring it to that level of it being a racket, if you will, under federal law to get Diddy. So they have to basically show a pattern. And a lot of people don't know this, and even a lot of attorneys and judges, but the definition of a racket is where you commit a crime more than once. So in theory, if you commit a crime twice, you're a racketeer. It's kind of hard to believe, but normally you associate it with repeated, ongoing criminality under the umbrella of some type of an enterprise. So what these 2 women are doing between Cassie and Mia is showing that this is not just a one-off. This is not an isolated incident. These incidents now are starting to stack, which makes it starting to look like the ordinary course of the business. And I'm telling you right now, it's not looking good for Diddy.
So let's just talk more about that with, Mia's specific testimony. How is that proving RICO or sex trafficking? The alleged sexual assault, or is it, the alleged physical violence? Her not going to HR because she's saying that HR wasn't really a thing at his company. Like, from what she's saying, how does it prove it?
Well, in a civil context, she could just file a sexual harassment lawsuit or go out on workers' comp, and that would be easy to settle. I mean, I know plenty of attorneys out there who would be salivating over those types of lawsuits, and they would try to get in on the payday. But criminally, I got to tell you, the government's a little handcuffed because the stateside local prosecutors in the DA's office never filed charges. And all of those crimes are time barred because they go back so many years. I mean, these young ladies started getting beaten, back in 2010, 2011. Domestic violence alone has a 4-year statute of limitations in California. And even if you try to get him on let's say, a pimping and pandering theory, I think it's an 8-year statute. So those crimes are long gone. You can't get them. So what do? You go federally, and federally, if you can show and basically 2 or more incidents of these predicate acts, be it assault, be it rape, be it arson, brandishing a firearm in somebody's face, these types of criminal threats and wielding weapons, that's how you build a case. But standing alone, if all you have is just isolated acts of violence, what this pattern tends to show with weapons and all types of veiled threats is that it was accomplished by force, fraud, or coercion. The force, fraud, or coercion is an element of the RICO statute. Absent that, the jury cannot convict.
So we can say, okay, we need 2 or more predicate acts. So that could, essentially be Cassie Ventura's testimony when she went on the stand and said that Diddy allegedly raped her, Diddy allegedly hit her. And then now we have Mia's testimony essentially saying the exact same thing, that Mr. Combs allegedly sexually assaulted her, hit her, and the force and coercion, all of those things. We just proved RICO right there, essentially, is what you're saying.
Right. I mean, if all you had was just Cassie standing alone, basically what Diddy, and I would defend him on it. I absolutely would. I'd go to New York pro bono because I think it would be improperly charged under the RICO statute. Really, what he is then on that fact pattern is a domestic batterer. And certainly not trying to trivialize it, but there's a separate body of law to get him under. You get him for spousal battery or domestic violence or just ordinary assault and battery. But because everybody sat on the clock and let the time tick away, they can't get him stateside. So you have to go federal. So now what do? You show that it's not just one victim within the Combs orbit. You start bringing in other people like personal assistants, other employees, maybe vendors of the Combs enterprise, people who are performing services for the enterprise, the plumber, the electrician, the hairdresser, the makeup artist. When you start looping in all these people who are saying these people are getting beaten, they're getting pistol whipped, they're getting threatened, their livelihood is on the line, then it really starts to look like a criminal racket. And now what we're starting to see is it going from the infancy stage into it ripening into a true racket. And I'm sure right now, Diddy is shaking in his boots because the man is looking at life if convicted.
Right. And so we just talked about Cassie and Mia having similar testimonies with the sexual assault. Also, with physical assault, we know that the former stylist said that Diddy physically hit him, allegedly. We know Mia said that she was physically hit. Cassie said she was physically hit. All of this alleged. So now it's like you could break that down for each thing could be like that, right?
Yeah, and you know what's even scarier, Kennedy, and a lot of people don't know this, and this is actually kind of terrifying. The prosecution does not have to prove each predicate act beyond a reasonable doubt. So the jury doesn't get a special verdict form while deliberating as to whether or not they find the sexual assault's true, the threats true, the coercion true. They don't have to find any of that true. All they have to find is that, I guess, under the totality of the circumstances, predicate acts have been proven. That's it. And you don't even have to have unanimity on them. So if you just throw a bunch of predicate acts at the jury sort of in a vacuum and not even necessarily in isolation, but where they can kind of look at it all in combination, the jury can come back with a guilty. It's pretty frightening. And the prosecution is not bound by the statute of limitations for each predicate act. So remember, under state law, the DV or the Domestic Violence Acts, here in California, you got to get to the courthouse within 4 years of the crime, or that charge is time barred. But under federal RICO law, they can claw back decades. They can claw back 10 years outside the state statute of limitations and lump it in as a predicate act as long as the RICO itself is filed on time. So it's pretty scary how far back prosecutors can go. It's almost as if you have to watch your back from adolescence all the way to death as a citizen of this country out of fear that someone's just going to kind of glob onto something you did years ago and hold it against you at a federal criminal trial. It's pretty scary stuff.
And usually we know, I've seen defense attorneys say, well, hey, there's no physical evidence, so it can't be proved. There was no rape kit. There was no DNA. But in this case, they don't need that, correct?
They don't need any of it. It's all credibility. If the jury believes these witnesses, that's enough. I think they even get a special jury instruction that says that they can convict on the testimony of one eyewitness. So in theory, they don't even need this menagerie of witnesses to come in to testify about everything that Combs did to these people. If you have one person who says, for example, let's say it's Mia, and Mia comes in and says, I saw Sean Diddy do this to so-and-so. I saw him or heard him threaten her life. I heard him take a knife or saw him take a knife on this day. In theory, they don't even have to bring in all those people. They can just present it through one witness. But practically speaking, juries really need to hear from everybody, because at some point the prosecution will start to lose credibility, and it's going to look like that they are ganging up on him really without the goods. And juries, especially nowadays, they don't have a hard time convicting, but a lot of them really do have a conscience. And they want to make sure that they are convicting people based on rock solid evidence and not on hearsay. And unfortunately, you can convict of a RICO violation based on hearsay. It's sad, but true.
Is it dogpiling, though, or is it just that Mr. Combs has been in business for decades and decades, and maybe there are this many victims?
Of course. And I don't want to minimize what he did to anybody. Don't get me wrong. But, there's an old expression, not just in law, but in the literature, that we are not defined by the sum of our worst day. In other words, just because you have a couple of bad days in life, maybe spread out biannually, annually, does that really define who you are as an individual? Because what's interesting, when you look at some of the evidence of the women involved in Diddy's world, you see them smiling at Burning Man, you see them giving the peace sign at parties, you see them hugging, you see them kissing. So it wasn't all bad. The problem is that when it goes from the good and morphs into the bad, it literally goes from that old, I don't know if you remember the comedy tragedy masks that we see in theater arts, but that's what it does. And it just flips like with absolutely no notice, where he just goes from like this healthy, normal affect to almost like this manic craziness. And it puts people in fear for their lives. And if he's doing all of this under the umbrella of the Combs enterprise, unfortunately, this man's looking at life.
And you bring up a good point there with, some of the victims appearing in photos of Mr. Combs looking happy. Some people may ask, why didn't she leave? Or why didn't she say something sooner? From a legal standpoint, how do prosecutors handle that kind of victim blaming? Because there was a moment when Mia did say why. She did say, she couldn't even say no to a sandwich. So that's why she couldn't say no to Mr. Combs. But on the other hand, could the defense argue, well, you worked for him for 8 years?
The practical reality is, Kennedi, that just about every juror has had to work for somebody else in life. I'm not going to say that all jurors are self-employed, that they're the captain of their own ship, but they understand what it means to have to respect to respect authority in the workplace and have to work for other people. And they are 100% dependent on their employer to keep their job open, keep the paycheck going. And sometimes people don't have the means, they don't have the contacts, and they might not even have the will to find other employment. So they feel trapped. And when you feel trapped, it means you have to endure what's being perpetrated on you by a taskmaster for a boss. And at some point, it morphs from being an employer-employee relationship almost to indentured servitude. And there's no way out. And our laws proscribe indentured servitude, peonage, and trafficking. And that's what happens. And then there's an entire pathology, particularly in the romantic relationships, why people stay in these relationships. And it goes back to this entire, I don't know if I necessarily want to call it a sickness, but it's this cycle of human tolerance, human forgiveness, and yet there is also a limit. But when people reach the limit and your abuser or your oppressor comes back and tries to make good and make up for what they've done, then you fall back into that cycle and you start reliving the drama all over again. And then it goes back to that comedy drama type cycle where things are good again. And then there's this sort of brief pause, and then the violence starts up again. And at some point, it's crazy making. But they're trapped because they can't just leave and make a life for themselves without having to become impoverished. And that's the fear. We see that, for example, with battered spouses. We even see it with battered children. They're too young to get out of a house. They're too young to go truant maybe, or be afraid to run away. They have nowhere to go. Cops won't listen to them. Neighbors won't listen to them. Instead, they just bring them back to that same violent environment. And at some point, you don't know what to do. Now, in this case, fortunately, women left and they did eventually get out. And thank goodness they did, because Lord only knows if they would have survived it.
Right. And you touch on the emotion there. And I think that that's very important because several of these witnesses have cried on the stand. We saw it with Cassie, with Capricorn Clark, and now Mia. Mia testified that she was going to die with this secret. Can powerful lines like that impact how a jury feels and ultimately rules?
Absolutely. Because remember, one of the elements is force, fraud, or coercion. And if these witnesses / victims are truly feeling the wrath of Diddy through force, fraud, or coercion, then the jury can convict. So far, I think they've made out the predicate acts, and these witnesses have made a compelling case in front of the jury that it was all done by coercion. It's not looking good for Diddy, I got to tell you. I don't know what that offer was before the trial started, but it's probably looking pretty good right now, and he might be having second thoughts about not having taken it.
Well, how does the defense go about combating this testimony?
Well, look, I don't think that it's difficult for jurors to see that not every relationship is perfect. And you're not condoning what Diddy did, for lack of a better term, but that you argue to the jury that everything is improperly filed. He is not charged with domestic violence. So you're not telling the jury that your client is a Vienna choir boy. And you're certainly not asking the jury to invite him over for Sabbath dinner, or to set a Seder plate for him, But that's not what's before them. What is before them is to see whether or not there was no consent, and whether or not this was in fact done by force, fraud, or coercion. And it's pretty scary how you can be in a relationship and things are hot and cold, emotions ebb and flow, there are highs and lows, but then suddenly you're behind the V, as we say in a criminal case, where if a victim says, yes, yes, it's good, but then if they change and say, no, no, you're a criminal. And I think the test for the jury is going to be whether or not these quote unquote victims really did consent. And if in Diddy's mind, he reasonably believed that they consented, because that's the standard. Did he reasonably believe that they consented? And if he reasonably believed that, the burden shifts to the federal government to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they did not consent. And you never know, he really might be able to hang it. My fear is, though, that he would probably have to testify and explain to the jury why his beliefs were reasonable at the time. And certainly he would have to fall on the sword and explain that he wasn't the greatest partner, he probably wasn't the greatest boss, but that he wasn't a racketeer or a trafficker.
Well, when you say there's some things maybe Mr. Combs didn't realize, could it be argued with Mia taking the stand and in her own words saying that she did not say no? Could the defense say, well, how was Mr. Combs supposed to know otherwise?
Absolutely, because there's a doctrine in the law, we call it assertive conduct. Okay, assertive conduct means that people can consent and acquiesce and agree and just by way of their conduct. So in theory, you can go to a bar, hang out, you spot somebody that you're interested in without actually voicing the words, hey, you want to come home with me? Instead, what you do, you're buying each other a drink, you're hugging, maybe even planting a kiss on each other. And before you know it, you're walking out to the car, you're getting into the car, and you're going over to their place. But does that mean that it was articulated? No. So you look at the behavior. The behavior suggests that there's consent. You don't see anybody pulling away. You don't see anybody slapping the other person, saying, take your hands off me, or, I'm not that type of person. I'm not interested. No. So you look at the behavior and you watch it just sort of flow and move almost like a medley. And you say to yourself, how else could you interpret this? This looks like an act of consent. Now, you might not like what went down during, the course of everything, but you never once tried to back out. You never once said, no, I want out. And if they did, and midstream did try to get out, and Diddy continued anyway, that's a sexual assault. That is rape. Just like yes means yes, no also means no. Even if you're in the heat of things and you are midstream and your victim says stop, no more, and you do not stop, that is a predicate act under RICO. But let's just pretend hypothetically that nobody ever said stop. But instead, they're just thinking it. Oh, I wish he would get off of me. I wish he would just stop already. Why doesn't he just die? Get away from me. But you don't voice it. You don't articulate it. The man is not the great Karnak. He's not a mind reader. And now to come after him 15 years later and call him a trafficker, a racketeer, a rapist, I think a jury might have a hard time. I really do. To be fair.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Mia's argument just that she was just too afraid and thought that he would ruin her life and ruin her career if she said no. She said he was a very powerful man, so she just felt voiceless, essentially. But some people compare Mia's story to what we saw in the Weinstein case. Do you think this case is headed in that direction legally?
I don't see it as the Weinstein case. I see it a little different. I almost see it like the Epstein, Ghislaine, Maxwell type scenario.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. Absolutely.
Right? You know what I mean? Where Ghislaine is kind of looking for people, grooming them, bringing them, to the leader, to the mob boss, if you will, And then, but I think the distinction between Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein is that I don't believe that Jeffrey ever victimized Ghislaine. Instead, he always rewarded her. They were literally like thick as thieves, kind of partners in crime. Whereas here, I think what you've got, it's a little different. You've got everybody intimately involved on a daily basis in an employment situation, as opposed to just purely a party situation. And that employment sort of umbrella is what kind of triggers the enterprise aspect of RICO. And I think the jury can infer, well, look, this guy's running a business. He's got people in his employ. He's victimizing them. He's putting them in indentured servitude in a form of peonage. Yeah, he might be paying them a pittance, but he's doing it by force, fraud, or coercion. That's called a racket. So it could go either way, I think. But I will tell you that the more victims that they have coming in, the more insurmountable it will be for Diddy. But when you have one or two people, you could be able to argue it as maybe people who are disgruntled. They were the hopeful sort of monkey wannabe starlets, R&B singers, agents, people from the music world who really thought that they were going to be titans and dynamos, only to have their hopes dashed because Diddy dumped them. And now they get to come in and have the last word, take that stand and take down Diddy. And I think that's how you play it. But that can only work, I think, if you only have a couple of people. And it remains to be seen who else they have coming in to take the stand who was victimized by him. Because the more you have, the more insurmountable it becomes.
Right. And we have weeks more. So we are definitely going to be following this
Yeah.
case very closely to see what happens. Philip, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, Kennedy. Have a great weekend.
Sean Combs denies all allegations. For all of the Diddy trial coverage, you can watch our live shows every weekday at 12 noon Eastern and continue to follow our uploads right here on the Law and Crime YouTube channel. For Law and Crime, I'm Kennedi Walker.